hard to know what.
So Ellen helped me put it together. And then they're all separated by.
I did get to, yeah. I think thank you very much. Yeah, I don't have any concerns with we're also going to post and people online. Watching them and how we need to do this. I was not to say. Yeah. Right. Yeah, maybe this is new. Like, two people know how to use it. Yeah, not many more than so I don't think you could probably do it. Like, the recommendation would be a good dollar amount. So I think that's already pretty clear. They're approving every project that whatever the numbers are. Yeah, I was just
No, I'm no longer staff. I don't have to.
Yeah, but if they keep track of it too, in case people does some of these that we have the dollar. One thing that we have this delegate company. That would be ideal. Yeah, I think what you really need is just if you have the, maybe it's switching back to the first one. Okay, cool. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Yeah, so better now than 10 years. Yeah, that'll be nice. Yeah, lots of people. Okay, and after that, take one time. Well, I forgot to give you a hangout, but I'm not using one this time because it's basically all in mine.
I know, I just put it on there.
Yeah. I didn't get a chance, so I was like, basically my handout.
All the way.
Yeah. Okay. Just seeing, I don't see many go.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good morning. We're going to begin today's hearing, Assembly Budget Subcommittee on Education and Finance. Today's hearing, of course, is our community colleges portion of the budget process. Today, we're going to be focusing on the funding formula, the Promise program, capital outlay, online college, as well as basic needs. We certainly know that our community colleges are the workhorse of our higher education system here in California, and the early January budget provided a good starting point for basic funding for our community colleges. Not a lot of extras that we had in the prior years, but we have a few programs that we want to go over that we had funded in the last couple of years. So with that, we will begin with issue number 1, funding formula and apportionments. Please proceed. Yes, and we're going to take roll real quick.
McCarty.
Here.
Bro. Here. Medina. Here. O'Donnell. Quorum is established.
Okay, please proceed.
Okay. Good morning, Chair and members. Michelle Nguyen with the Department of Finance. The governor's budget continues to implement the student-centered funding formula, which was established in the 2018 Budget Act. In addition to enrollment, the formula allocates general purpose apportionments to community colleges based on additional factors such as the number of low-income students enrolled and specified student success metrics, such as the completion of a degree or certificate. In 2018-19, approximately 70% of funding was distributed based on total enrollment, 20% on enrollment of low-income students, and 10% on student success metrics. This is the first year of implementation for the student-centered funding formula, and the governor's budget proposes some revisions to the implementation plan for the formula. Specifically, maintaining 2018-19 rates for the funding formula into 2019-20. Capping year-over-year growth for the student success allocation at 10%, and clarifying that the definition of transfers should reflect an unduplicated count of students. These revisions were proposed to address issues regarding anomalies in the data for the student success and supplemental allocations. This proposal is also intended to give sufficient time to address the formula's long-term fiscal stability and improve the accuracy of data reported by districts. The governor's budget also provides additional funding for apportionments, including $26 million Proposition 98 General Fund for enrollment growth of 0.55%, and $248 million Proposition 98 General Fund for a 3.46% cost of living adjustment. Thank you, and happy to take questions.
Okay.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. Edgar Cabral with the Legislative Analyst Office. I want to cover 2 issues related to apportionments here. First is an issue that's in your agenda, which is related to a potential shortfall in 1819. I know there are a couple of variable estimates of the shortfall, but this is something that may be a decision for you come May. If the administration has not proposed to backfill that shortfall at the May revision, will be whether or not you want to provide additional general fund to backfill that. Providing some funding to backfill that shortfall might be something that would help ensure that you're signaling support for the funding formula and for the concerns with improving student outcomes. But we do know that this is a year when there are more limited Prop 98 resources, and that might not be something that is feasible this year. If you do decide not to backfill the shortfall, one question will be how that shortfall is distributed across the state. And the Chancellor's Office has indicated that their preference is to assure colleges that they would be receiving at least 1718 plus COLA, so that some of the districts that didn't get as much under the new funding formula wouldn't take much of the cut. We think this approach seems reasonable, given that there is a pretty big variability in the year-to-year increases that districts received under the new formula. The next, I wanted to talk about the 2 proposals related to the 1920 budget and our assessment and recommendations here. So first, on the proposal to delay the implementation of delay the increase in the student success allocation, we do think that is a reasonable approach. We do think that there are some data issues for the state to work out. There's a chart on page 7 of your agenda that comes from our analysis, where we were looking at just the last 10 years of, this is specifically associate degrees awarded statewide and at various community college districts. The data looks similar if you're looking at certificates, but we do see some significant variation from year to year. There's not a clear exact one answer for why that's the case. We do think that addressing some of the concerns of reliability, accuracy of the data are important, and we know that the Chancellor's Office has indicated they're going to take several steps to address those issues. In talking to some districts, though, we do think there are some additional, there might be variation in this data, even if you did deal with sort of the data reliability issues. Sometimes you have districts going through specific local issues like changes in their local economy or changes in, for example, the number of transfer students that are admitted by CSUs in their local area that can significantly affect their year-to-year outcomes. So we would recommend that you change the student success allocation so that rather than being driven by 1 year's worth of outcome data, it's a 3-year rolling average. That would also make it consistent with the base allocation, which is distributed based on a 3-year rolling average of enrollment. That we think will help with stability for both districts, but also for the state in projecting what the funding will be in the future. On the second issue second proposal that the administration has related to putting a 10% cap on the year-to-year growth in the student success allocation, we do recommend rejecting that proposal. We're concerned that we appreciate the concern about containing costs in the formula, but we are concerned that that approach is a crude approach that could reduce financial incentives for some districts that are actually making notable improvements in student outcomes. So we would recommend considering other alternatives that would continue to have strong incentives for districts to improve outcomes, while at the same time controlling costs and avoiding some of the sort of negative incentives we might be concerned about. One particular, there are a number of ways that you could do this, but one specific approach that we would recommend is to limit the amount of outcome-based funding that comes from any individual student in any year. So for example, a student who earned an associate degree and a certificate, the district would only get funding for that associate degree. And we think that's an approach that continues to still give districts incentives to improve outcomes, to improve student success, but removes that negative incentive to sort of take students who are already completing and adding and encouraging them to take additional certificates. We think that approach would reduce costs in a way that still has strong incentives for improving student success more broadly. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Christian Osmania with the California Community College's Chancellor's Office. I'm going to be working off of this handout, and I'll start on page 2. Much of what we include in the handout has been covered by some of the other panelists, so I will move quickly. But on the top of page 2, I would just note that as we proposed changes to the funding formula last year, and as we continue to implement and think through potential amendments to the formula, we're guided by a set of 3 principles. 1, the goal of encouraging progress towards the vision for success, which has a North Star of closing achievement gaps, equity gaps in student outcomes by 2025. 2nd, to provide students who have faced additional barriers to success, principally students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, with additional support to meet the goals, and 3rd, to make these resources flexible and predictable. The bottom of page 2 has the structure of the formula that's been covered, so I'll move to the top of page 3. And just the agenda noted some of the concerns around the relative distribution of points under the formula. So I think you can infer 3 different ways in which the points were designed. First, particularly as part of the student success allocation. First, differences in costs based on differences of length of program. Second, the added costs that a district might incur towards incremental progress toward an outcome. And 3rd, a clear intent to create financial incentives around particular outcomes. I think this is most prominent in the additional points that are awarded for completion of an associate degree for transfer. At the bottom of page 3, I would just note we haven't talked yet about the funding stability provisions. Clearly, a goal of this formula was to make, over time, community college funding more stable. The formula includes a set of tests that define how much a district would receive in a given year. For 2018-19, a district, as the Legislative Analyst's Office has noted, would receive at least their 2017-18 revenues adjusted by the changes in the cost of living in 2018-19. Beginning in 2019-20, we see a set of tests that compare what a district would have received under the student-centered funding formula in the current year with what they would receive in the prior year, and we fund them at least at the higher of the 2. Moving on to page 4, I would just note when we talk about a split of 70-20-10, what we're suggesting is that the base allocation would represent statewide about 70% of funding, the supplemental allocation 20%, the student success allocation 10%. Based on our most recent estimate of costs of the funding formula in 2018-19, that's generally what you see, significant resources allocated towards the base allocation, and the shares declining rapidly beyond that. I also wanted to note at the bottom of page 4, when the legislature and governor enacted the funding formula last year, they included provisions around local goal setting, planning, and budgeting, with the intent that districts, in thinking about how to respond to the new incentives, are having a set of conversations with their communities about how those dollars would be used to support achievement of the vision for success. Specifically, districts are required by the end of this year, this academic year, to adopt goals that are aligned with the vision for success. Moving forward, we expect that they'll adopt comprehensive plans, educational plans that align with those goals, and that their budgets would be aligned with those comprehensive plans. I'm going to move to the bottom of page 5 as the legislative analyst notes. As of our most recent estimates of the costs of the formula, the current appropriations for the current fiscal year 2018-19 are insufficient to cover the cost of the formula. There's 2 principal reasons. The total difference in available resources is $324 million. The differences are in 2 parts. One are the higher costs of the formula of about $143 million compared to what was estimated when the budget was enacted in June. This largely has to deal with both increases in the cost of the student success allocation associated with higher than projected outcomes, student outcomes, as well as increases in the cost of the hold harmless. The revenues that districts received in 2017-18 was higher than what was projected, and therefore the hold harmless in 2018-19 is higher. The other source of the difference is about $181 million associated with lower property tax revenue collections than what was estimated in the Budget Act of 2018. To the extent, our ask would be, to the extent that property taxes don't increase, that the legislature, consistent with the provisions of Proposition 98, backfill the funds to eliminate that portion of the deficit. As the analyst noted, in communicating then to districts about what they should be expecting for the current year, which ends in less than 3 months, we've told all districts that, consistent with the hold harmless provisions in the funding formula, districts should expect to receive at least their 2017-18 revenues adjusted by the changes in the cost of living. I'll close on page 6 in response to concerns the chancellors had, concerns we've heard from the field, and the governor's proposals. The chancellor asked an advisory work group on fiscal affairs to look at some issues related to the funding formula and to advise him on amendments to the student-centered funding formula, including for 2019-20. Having broken those issues out into 2 categories, the first is structural issues. There are probably 3 questions we're looking at there. First, consistent with the governor's proposal, how should the formula constrain year-to-year increases in revenues, given the state's constraints in revenues? Second, how do we determine what data to pull from? Currently, the funding formula uses prior year data for the student success allocation and for the supplemental allocation. It's been suggested, given our desire for more certainty, that we use even prior year data to calculate district apportionments. And then which groups of students are intended to be supported. Currently, the legislature and governor have made decisions about different funding allocations, including for students enrolled in students in correctional facilities and high school students. The second set of issues are related to the student success allocation. The first, the LAO mentioned already, how should the formula account for students who earn more than 1 award in a given year? To which districts, consistent with the governor's proposal, should post-college outcomes like transfer to a 4-year institution be attributed? And how might the definitions of these measures better be refined to account for the goals that we are trying to achieve? And then finally, as both the governor has noted and the LAO referenced, the chancellor is interested in making sure that there is confidence in both the reliability and the validity of the data that's being used in the funding formula. We've contracted with the Fiscal Crisis and Management Assistance Team to review the data at a subset of colleges and make recommendations to us based on common practices and best practices of the colleges. We expect to receive that report later this month with the goal that it could inform new policies that we implement and potential audit procedures. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Seeing none. Sorry, Mr. Bro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Question for the community colleges. A couple of weeks ago, I had some veteran students. I have Saddleback College in my district. They were informing me of a request for $20 million for the Veterans Resource Centers, but there's $5 million in your proposal. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
There's been funding in prior years. There's no funding in the Board of Governors requests and no funding specifically in the governor's budget. What I would say, I think it is clearly a population that we have identified as having likely barriers to success in the community colleges. As part of our Student Equity and Achievement Program, a large pot of funds that colleges have available to address equity gaps. Veterans are identified as a category of students that colleges should be planning for particular services for.
So was this $20 million funded previously, but just not funded now?
There has been one-time funding in recent years. The numbers are escaping me, and I don't know if finance or the LAO has them off the top of their head.
If you can get back to us on that.
Yeah. And it's certainly, we've received the request for additional funding in the budget year. We did not include it in our request, given a broader philosophy that colleges should be planning for the specific populations of students that have the greatest needs on at their campuses.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. O'Donnell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentations. I realize the funding formula is new. I'm not sure. I hope you've indicated we're going to take a look at this, and we really need to take a look at it because I'm not sure that we're getting it right at this point. We've got a shortfall of, $324 million. Is that correct?
That's the projection, I would say. I think part of that, the $120 million, is more, I think they're for two different reasons.
Tax issues?
The tax issues, I think, are more likely to be
So let's say 200. Let's just, for argument's sake. So where would that $200 million come from? I mean, there's, going forward, do you want us to give that to you? Are you going to find that within your own system? Are you going to go back and rebench what you promised previously? What's your strategy?
Yeah, so I would say, I think there is a clear request from our office that the state provide additional appropriations to fund the cost of the formula, whatever that deficit ultimately would be. We recognize that the historic practice, or the practice over the past 30 years, has been to fund community colleges consistent with the minimum guarantee. So we recognize that's the reality, that we are playing in a fixed pot of funds, though I think, in talking with folks throughout this system, I think there is a clear message that we need to have a much stronger message that the minimum guarantee is insufficient to meet the resource needs of the colleges. But yes, I think ultimately the request is the state should backfill whatever the formula costs. And moving forward, we should identify how to adjust the formula to fit within the resource needs that are reasonable for the state to provide.
The resource is, maybe not even the resource needs. I would say the resource is, because the need is greater than we're allocating. I'd concede that out of the gate, but given the confines we have with K-14 and Prop 98, and that this legislature chooses to make it a ceiling as opposed to a floor, right? That's our decision, and I think it's unfortunate. It's not one I support, but it is a fact. That's the dynamic we live in.
Sorry, to jump in for a second. We think that there are a few explanations for the Chancellor's Office reported current year apportionment shortfall. Historical trends in recent years, you can see that at this point in time, the Chancellor's Office property taxes have been underreported in the last few years at the P1 point in time, and that's largely related to when property taxes are collected for P1. In the last 3 years, property taxes have been underreported by, close to $180 million in the last 3 years. And we also think that there are some other explanations, such as in the Chancellor's Office calculation of expenditures for their current year shortfall. We think there's some overstating of expenditures, including miscalculation of the 3-year average for the base allocation of the funding formula. The Chancellor's Office also uses a definition of transfers that does not align with the governor's budget proposal to account for unduplicated transfers. And so for a lot of different reasons, we think that the reported shortfall in the current year is not as great as is currently being stated.
So would we fix this? Where would we address that? In the budget?
Yeah, right now we are.
I mean, the
we are
Department of
updating.
Finance has a lot of sway here, so I'm wondering, well, right now we're just talking about how do we get to a solution so that they don't do that again, if in fact they are doing that. I'm not saying you are doing that, but if that's happening, if there's accounting.
Yeah, we're updating expenditures as we're leading up to the May revision, which is coming up very soon. We're going to be receiving updated revenues, so we are monitoring, this situation very closely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you want to add something?
Marit Surkisa with the Department of Finance. I would just note that we're working closely to better understand the data, and we have updated data that we receive at the May revision. And typically when there are shifts in property tax revenues at the May revision, Finance proposes a mix of funds. So we're looking at the data.
The May revise may address this situation, because I have a challenge with the community college coming up here and saying, look, we have this big shortfall, and then you guys say, wait, maybe they don't. I just hope this would be worked out prior to this hearing going forward. That's just my take, but either way. Thank you. And then just a couple other thoughts, questions. With regard to the current funding formula, it is unpredictable. It bounces too much. I think we need to look at that. It's complex to implement. Even the LAO says it could fluctuate greatly from one year to another. So I think we need to look at that as you contemplate some changes to the funding formula. And the student success measures concern me greatly, because the student who transfers to a UC generates less funding than a transfer to a CSU because of that associate's degree requirement, which is something that's bothered me for some time. The chancellor came down, talked to me in my office, a man I know well, and I thought I laid my concerns, but they're back as to why we're even requiring an AA to transfer. That seems odd to me that we would require that, because it looks like when a student transfers to a CSU, it's scored higher on the indicators than if a student transfers to the UC. I'm wondering why that is. And again, I'm still wondering, go back to why we have the AA. And you can even answer, is that 60 units? Is it 56? Because I think 56 is the minimum required to transfer, as I recall. But the other question I have with regard to this formula and the measures associated with it are, would it promote and create would the college game the system by creating short-term certificates that don't really do much for students to ensure revenue growth? And do you want to speak to that?
I think part of that, I think we've talked in the past about, the expectation around transfer with an associate degree. We would say the funding formula does not require it. It certainly creates an incentive for colleges to put students on a path towards an ADT, the rationale being that students on a path towards an ADT, or students should not have to decide up front when they have a goal to transfer where specifically they want to transfer, that an ADT provides greater options. The system's working with the UC and with independent colleges to make sure that the ADT is a recognized transfer pathway for those institutions. Make sure that students leave the colleges with a degree in case they transfer and don't ultimately earn a degree. It gives them some guarantees if they attended the CSU. Recognizing your concerns, I think there are policy reasons, protections for students that we think leaving with an ADT provides.
Real quick, let me jump in there. So if I'm a college, I'm a community college, I'm going to incentivize those students who are on the AA path. I might even give them classes before I give students who aren't on the AA path, right? That's a problem, isn't it?
And I think the response might be, for students who enter the college with an educational goal of transfer, there should be one path. There should not be multiple paths. A transfer student who wants to earn an AA, a transfer student who wants to simply transfer without a degree. So I think the goal is, how do you make the ADT, the legislation limits the number of units in an ADT, And the goal is to say students should, who seek to transfer should have a clear pathway to transfer based on the academic program they're in, not based on the institution that they are seeking to transfer to.
Could the requirement that they have the AA force them to take units that they might not even need?
I would imagine there's a case I would imagine that that's probably the case in some instances, but
I think it's typical.
What's that?
It's not a typical experience.
I would argue it's not typical, but I think there are faculty and others here who probably, live that world day to day, and could probably answer that.
Keep going. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, and I am looking for my notes on your second question. Could you remind me the second part of the question?
It had to do with incentivizing colleges being incentivized
to below value,
create short-term certificates to promote student, rapid student achievement, thus more dollars.
I think it's in part, what we've said from the beginning is we need to review the formula. And so moving forward, I think that's a clear question that we have been partnering with outside researchers to help us understand is what impact does this formula have on the outcomes that our students attain. I would just note that, I think this funding formula lives next to, within a variety of other processes, including processes related to the approval of degrees and certificates that are intended to ensure program integrity. And so we think that there are protections in this system, but again, so there are protections certainly around the approval of those programs, whether it changes how colleges put students on a pathway and whether colleges put more students on a pathway to a short-term certificate. We believe there are other protections and certainly incentives in the funding formula that assign different value to different credentials based on the length of degree and certainly the labor market value of the degree. And so we think that the incentives are aligned. We think there are protections, but certainly we'll continue to review it.
Okay, well, but something's, maybe the word's wrong here if we end up with a $200 million deficit, give or take, right? I mean, the math somewhere is wrong. The formula somewhere is wrong. I think we'd all concede that.
I think I think what it suggests is that in designing the formula, the per workload measure rate may have needed to be refined last year.
Just on this issue of sort of certificates, I do think, I think there is good reason to want to monitor this issue, because I think I agree with Member O'Donnell that one of the things that we thought of as a bigger concern with the formula in terms of where there could be gaming is the issue of the lower unit certificates that could be a place where colleges spend the resources. We think that the recommendation that we suggest, and I think other groups have suggested as well, of capping the maximum amount that you could receive for any individual student at whatever the highest, the highest outcome earned, is one way to deal with that issue. So if you have a student who's getting an associate degree, tacking on additional certificates isn't necessarily going to add any additional funding for the community college district. We think that could be one way to address it. I would say also one of the proposals, I know we've heard about some concerns with complexity of the formula, and why don't we simplify it so that every outcome gets the same amount of funding. I actually would say that if we did that, I would have more concerns with those specific issues, because in that case, then you would have an 18-unit certificate that has the same value as, say, someone who transfers or someone who gets an associate degree. If that's the way we would create the formula, then I think that we would start to be more concerned about that, because now, as a community college district, you get the same amount of outcomes for getting somebody through an 18-unit program as someone who goes through a 60-unit program. So that's, I think, why there is, and it's important for us to monitor what's going on with all of these. How do we know that we've gotten the right values for each of them is very difficult. But if we do, if we have a more simplified system that is awarding everybody about the same amount when the amount of work required to get these different degrees is very different, that could be more problematic, I think, in terms of just how colleges might respond.
Yeah. And I would just, we intend to make a set of recommendations to you all by the end of the month about changes to the formula. We have vetted the Legislative Analyst's Office proposal on counting only the highest award with a variety of stakeholder groups, including our consultation council. I think it is a recommendation that we will be supportive of.
Recommendations to us, but the formula is an animal of the Chancellor's Office, correct?
It is specified in statute.
It is. It is. Okay. The existing structure is specified in statute?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I will thank you for your presentation and bring up issue 2, the Promise program. And I apologize if I didn't see on my agenda that there are actually 2 panels on the panel program. The first one, Department of Finance, Legislative Office, and Community College. Excuse me, Chancellor. My bad, as they say. I'll call you back. May begin.
Morning again. Michelle Nguyen with the Department of Finance. The governor's budget proposes $40 million Proposition 98 General Fund to support a second year of free tuition by extending the California College Promise to first-time full-time students in their second academic year. The proposal builds on current law as established by AB 19, which itself established California College Promise, and allows colleges to waive fees for the first year of college for first-time full-time students. The governor's budget proposal does not change any of the existing provisions of the current law except for extending the program to a second academic year. The governor's budget also proposes $5 million one-time non-Proposition 98 general fund for the Chancellor's Office to expand outreach around the California College Promise by establishing the Student Success Awareness Initiative. As more colleges implement Promise programs, there is a need to ensure that colleges can effectively communicate to students information about these Promise programs, the cost of college and their financial aid opportunities, and their pathways to success. This funding is intended to address that need. Thank you, and happy to answer further questions.
And if we could go ahead and continue with the Legislative Analyst's Office.
Thank you. Lisa King with Legislative Analyst's Office. I'll be speaking from your agenda, starting on page 13. The state has a long-standing program called the Board of Governors Fee Waiver that covers enrollment fees for students who have financial need at the community colleges. And currently, over 40% of community college students receive the fee waiver through this need-based program. As you'll recall, the state recently expanded fee waivers to certain students who do not have financial need, specifically first-time students who are enrolled full-time and in their first year of college. And that program is called the California College Promise. The state first funded this program, the California College Promise, in 2018-19. And in order to qualify for funds under this program, colleges must meet 6 requirements related to student support, which are listed in the middle of page 14 of your agenda. In this sense, the program is also intended to serve as an incentive for colleges. As the Department of Finance has shared, the governor is proposing an augmentation of $40 million in the 2019-20 budget that would allow colleges to provide fee waivers for first-time full-time students without financial need in their second year of college. Our office does have a number of concerns with this proposal, which are summarized on page 15 of your agenda, toward the middle of the page. Our first concern is primarily a matter of timing. Because 2018-19 is the first year in which the state has funded the College Promise program, we do not yet have sufficient outcomes to assess its impact on enrollment, financial aid participation, and other student outcomes. And without a better understanding of how the program is currently performing, we think it may be premature to substantially expand funding for it. Our second concern is more distributional in nature. There is currently a substantial amount of unmet financial need among community college students, particularly when it comes to non-tuition costs, which are not covered by the Board of Governors fee waiver for needy students. If the goal is to increase college affordability, then we think it makes sense to prioritize addressing the existing unmet need before expanding aid for students who do not demonstrate need. Finally, our third point just returns to the idea that the College Promise program is intended to serve as an incentive for colleges to improve student support. Here we would just note that since creating the College Promise program, the legislature has also enacted several other reforms, including the new funding formula, that provide even larger fiscal incentives for colleges to enhance student support. For those reasons, our office does recommend rejecting the governor's proposal and redirecting the $40 million proposed funding toward other Proposition 98 priorities. As the Department of Finance has explained, the governor's budget does also include a related proposal of $5 million one-time for outreach related to the College Promise and other student support initiatives. Our office is currently assessing this proposal, and we'll be sure to keep staff updated as we complete our write-up. Thank you. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Okay. Thank you. Community colleges?
Thank you. Krishna Osmani with the California Community Colleges. I will start on page 7 of the handout, and we've taken a slightly broader view just to provide some context about what the issues are that the College Promise is intended to solve. On the bottom of page 7, I think one way, I think it's important to describe who enrolls at the community colleges, who our students are. Two ways of describing them that I think are especially important for the conversation around the promise are their age, that nearly more than 40% of our students are over the age of 25. We tend to serve a population of students that skews older, certainly a population of students that is significant, is not coming to us directly out of high school. Second, we serve a very diverse population of students, most diverse population of students across segments here in California, with nearly half of our students identifying as Latinx. If you move on to page 8, we've talked about the history of enrollment fees in the community colleges. Again, enrollment fees today are $46 per unit, specified in statute, the lowest in the U.S. But nearly half of students and most of units are waived under the existing California College Promise Grant. At the bottom of page 8, we show that enrollment fees are an important part of the total cost of attendance. They're a significant part of the total cost of attendance, but they are a small part for both students who are identified as living at home and those who are living away from home. We show for one college total cost there, $13,000 for students living at home, $23,000 for students away from home. For a student attending full-time, that $1,300 tuition for the year is less than 10% of the total costs that they face. And so if you look at the top of page 9, we include an analysis performed by the Institute for College Access and Success that shows that for students across the regions where there is a UC campus, in none of the regions is the community college the lowest net price for the lowest income students, and in 7 of the regions it is the highest cost compared to the UC and the CSU. And so with that, we at the bottom of page 9 talk a little bit about the College Promise program. And I want to just highlight the legislative intent included with the program that's consistent with the intent included in our Vision for Success, to increase college preparation, improve preparation for jobs, increase transfer from the UC to the UC and the CSU, and to eliminate equity gaps both across groups of students but also across regions of the state. And so, as the legislative analyst and the Department of Finance have described, there are a number of requirements in AB 19 to participate in the program, and the statute authorizes but does not require that colleges waive fees for first-time, full-time students who do not already receive fee waivers. At the bottom of page 10, we show how we allocated the funds. So in 2018-19, the legislature appropriated $46 million. We used first as the primary criteria the number of units at a college that were not waived under the existing fee waiver policies. That was about $36 million of the allocation. With the remaining funds, we allocated that to colleges based on their full-time equivalent student enrollment and their counts of Pell Grant recipients. For 1920, should the legislature approve the funding in the governor's budget of $80 million, we would expect that we would only allocate the funding based on the number of first-time, full-time students not currently receiving fee waivers. And then to close on the College Promise program specifically for 18-19, 105 colleges chose to participate in the program. Most used at least part of their money for fee waivers for those first-time, full-time students who do not currently receive the California College Promise Grant. Some colleges did use money for grants for non-tuition costs, including food, transportation, and books. And some colleges used funding for support services like counselors and advisors. We've been working with the 9 colleges that chose not to participate in 2018-19 to work with them to participate in 19-20. We believe that at least 4 will participate in the program in the coming year. And then with regard to the governor's proposal around the Student Success Awareness Initiative, we're supportive of the proposal. We believe that if improved messaging is an important part of how College Promise programs work, then we need to do more work to make sure that students across the state receive a coherent message around what a College Promise means. Happy to answer questions.
Okay. Thank you. I think we're going to go to our second panel here, hearing from some colleges from across California before we get to the Q&A. We're missing the Santa Barbara person. Where's your person? Limon. Okay, so he is here. Okay, yes. I know we had a great competition with him in Santa Barbara, so we wanted to get their perspective up here. But with that, we'll begin with our chancellor from Los Angeles, as well as our superintendent president from Lake Tahoe. So welcome back to Sacramento,
yes, sir. Thank you.
Chancellor.
Good morning, Chairman McCarty, members of the committee. I'm Dr. Francisco Rodriguez, chancellor of the Los Angeles Community College District. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and my colleague from Lake Tahoe. On behalf of the LA Community College District, the Board of Trustees, our students at our 9 colleges, let me start by thanking you for your leadership and support for the California College Promise program. This program has delivered on a promise of a brighter future for thousands of students throughout the state of California. And California will see the benefits of your investment for generations to come. In Los Angeles, the LA College Promise program began in 2017 as a collaboration with our district, the Los Angeles Unified School District, and the city of Los Angeles. Thanks to the leadership of LA Mayor Eric Garcetti and generous donors, we were able to begin our program prior to AB 19 becoming law in the fall of 18. For LAC City students and their families, this program is much more than free tuition. The LA College Promise program is a student success program developed based on nationwide best practices. Today, the program serves nearly 9,500 students and requires full-time enrollment, a structured educational plan that includes math and English, applying for both state and federal financial aid if they're eligible, and a commitment to participate in student support interventions. The core of the program provides enhanced high school outreach, tuition-free education for the first year and second year, priority registration, access to success programs, and serve as ambassadors in a no-cost international enrichment program funded again with support from the mayor's office and generous donors. This program over the last year has taken College Promise students to Egypt, Mexico, Japan, and this summer we'll be sending Promise students to France and Vietnam as an enrichment experience. Many of our students have never been out of their neighborhoods, so this provides a unique experience for them indeed. As you are aware, many of our students are housing and food insecure. Efforts to assist students with increased financial aid that covers their basic needs will go a long way in helping students fulfill their educational potential. For our state's community colleges, the ability to tell all students in our community that their first year of tuition is free has enabled us to break down access barriers that have prevented students from attempting a college education or a lifetime career or profession. As a result, this message has been powerful in improving college access and success in our communities. Consider the results of LA in only 2 years. Overall enrollment for recent LAUSD graduates has increased by 24%. Full-time enrollment for first-time college students from LAUSD has increased 54% district-wide. And from our first cohort of LA College Promise students, more than 500 are ready to transfer and eligible to graduate this spring. And the populations served are those that are traditionally underrepresented. You know the statistics and the demography of Los Angeles well. Far from the claims that free college program serves those who can afford it, our program is 72% Latinx, 82% low income based on the California Promise Grant criteria. Our initial cohort has shown these dramatic positive outcomes. Over 90% of our students attempted English and math, with more students in the program completing transfer level of both than we had seen previously across the entire district. 89% of fall semester students persisted to the spring semester. 76% from that spring persisted to fall, more than 3 out of 4, with over 2,000 students continuing on as full-time students, which we know is the key to academic success. We're on track to have hundreds of students complete in only 2 years this spring and look forward to reporting that data in the fall. The benefits of AB 19 and now AB 2 fuels our ability to sustain our commitment to provide a college education to our students and to our communities. The investments have had a major impact well beyond the tuition that students receive. The program builds a strong, forward-looking, college-going culture, one that through inclusion of all and has served those most in need and built a student success program that has produced these wonderful, and for us in LA, unparalleled outcomes. Finally, and in closing, I want to mention the mounting support that this program has instilled in our community. It is indeed a talking and leveraging point. The LA College Promise program has brought together business, civic, and philanthropic partners and has built a mutual sense of commitment for our community college students. On May 29, all of our partners will join us in the celebration of our first LA College Promise graduation hosted by Mayor Garcetti. For these reasons and many more that I can state, LAC City strongly supports expanding this program for 2 years of tuition-free community college education in California. It's simply the best investment. We have witnessed firsthand in Los Angeles a tremendous success in extending the program for a second year. Our students have told us that a second year of financial aid support has allowed them to maintain their full-time status and indeed their ultimate success. The governor's proposal in AB 2 would allow us to continue this commitment for all students so that they too can complete the promise and achieve their educational goals. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for your time, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chancellor. We'll come back to you in a moment. President DeFranco.
Great. Chairman McCarty, members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to present to you today. My name is Jeff DeFranco. I'm Superintendent President for Lake Tahoe Community College District. It's good that we're up here with LA, so we're going to give you the opposite end of the spectrum. We are considered a small rural community college. We serve about 2,000 FTS in the South Lake Tahoe community. But to give you a sense, many of our students are high need. About 36% of them are first generation at this time, and College Promise has been very transformative for our campus and our community. I do want to thank you for your past support of California community colleges and specifically this program. It's been a catalyst at our campus, LA, and many others throughout the state. I have 3 major points to hit on through my presentation. I want to share with you our current program and how it was made possible through AB 19, our future expansion and what the state could do to support it, and finally, some of the research on College Promise programs nationally and how we compare to Oregon, Tennessee, and other states that are leading the way along with California. So the Lake Tahoe College Promise was actually launched in fall of 2018. We had been talking to our foundation about getting behind this initiative. It was Assembly Bill 19 that allowed us to move. It created that catalyst moment to go forward. In addition to providing tuition waivers for our first-time, full-time students, we have braided our state funds with local funds to provide transportation for all our students, so free bus passes so they could get to and from work and school, and additionally infused our lending library so students have access to checkout textbooks for their academic term to to not have to buy those. And of course, we've coupled that with our open educational resource efforts, and our foundation has taken more of its local funds and tripled its emergency book fund for students that can't meet their book needs through those other mechanisms. So our program not only has expanded the tuition waivers, but provided other supports that are critical for all of our students, but specifically many of our low-income students that only traditionally benefited for what was known as the Board of Governors fee waiver. We have some preliminary results to share. This fall, 2018, our first-time full-time enrollment is up 10% year over year. So College Promise is clearly meeting its goal as being an access initiative. And I will share with you that a vast majority of those students actually would have qualified under what was formerly known as the Board of Governors fee waiver. But it's the simplified message of first-time, full-time, tuition-free that is understood by our students, their families, specifically many of our first-generation families. And I think that is an important point to make, because many times folks say this Assembly Bill 2 or the governor's budget is just going to benefit students that do not have needs. But our ability to say first-time, full-time, tuition-free really clarifies that the doors are open to all students, and that is a message that's easily understood. So where are we going from here? We are, with the support of our foundation, doing a 3-year on-ramp to expand student support services beyond tuition waivers, but during those 3 years, in addition to the lending library and bus passes, that they will get book stipends each term as they persist. So it's basically a carrot to help students in movement to persist, because we know that access isn't simply enough, and we're trying to move this from an access program to actually a completion program, which is very much aligned with the state's programs and priorities. I could share with you that it is the state who is helping making this possible, because as the state has funded 1 year and hopefully will expand to 2 years here, it allows me to go to my local foundation and ask them to redirect their funds for all these wraparound support student services, such as books and transportation, as well as monies, local monies for peer mentoring and dedicated counselor for our promised students, that we know these things, these wraparound services, make a difference for completion. To give you one example, the current national average for 3-year completion is 22% for the student cohort. At City University of New York Community Colleges, they're seeing greater than 50% completion for 3-year students through providing these wraparound services. We can learn from that, and by the state support for tuition waivers, couple that with our local monies to provide those additional wraparound services. So finally, I shared with you here today a policy brief that I put together that really takes a look at what's happening out there nationwide. And we all know some of the challenges with workforce readiness, student debt, access to higher education, and those are well documented. But looking at Tennessee, Oregon, New York, these other states that are taking the lead on statewide programs, we are there along their side. But I think California has a chance here to be a leader again, as we often had, and not just make this about a 1-year access initiative, but move from access to completion by providing multiple years of tuition waivers for students. So not only could they get in the door, but they could actually get across the stage and move on and be contributing members of society. So I would encourage you to...
You're saying more than 2 years?
I think 2 years is the next step. I think 2 years is the next step, which is a good alignment with your Guided Pathways initiative and your focus on completion. And I would encourage this committee to look at supporting Assembly Bill 2, the governor's proposed budget, methods to make progress toward that second year. I could tell you locally we're going to be providing 3 years of foundation support for our students for the book vouchers and those other mechanisms, because we know that sometimes it takes students more than 2 years to get through the path. So I thank you for your time, and stand ready to answer questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Green. Hi.
Thank you.
Morning.
Hello.
Yeah, how are you?
Very well. Thank you for the invitation, Chairman McCarthy and members of the committee. I've got something I think is being passed around right now. So my name is Jeff Green. I'm the CEO of the Santa Barbara City College Foundation. And we're coming at this as a college that actually launched a promise just prior to it was really at the early part of the wave here in California. So I thought I could share with you a little bit of what we've learned. This is something that I had an opportunity to share with Chairman McCarty last fall, as well as Assemblymember Limon. And this is really an overview of what we have tried to do. I will skip through some of the overview, and you can take a look at that at will. But what we tried to do in 2015, we really set out to see what a model promise might look like. And this was at a time when there were only 3 promise efforts in the state. And those were, of course, Ventura first, then Long Beach, and then on to Cuesta, our neighbor to the north. So What we did is we surveyed about 30 programs around the country at the time to ask what really worked best, and if resources weren't the barrier, what would be possible. The way they all came back with their responses was unanimous, essentially, that if they weren't constrained by resources, they would do 2 full years, all-inclusive, and open access to the entirety of the local school districts. So that's what we set out to do. And we made our eligibility requirements very broad intentionally. We can talk about that later if there's an interest. But you can see here the scope and design was basically based on our research, and there were 3 primary pillars to that. The first was completely open access to all local students. And that was regardless of performance in high school, regardless of demonstrated need or not, because we all know that there's, of course, need that's often not clear when put to paper. So what we did is we offered that. We priced it out. And we came up with about a $2.4 million annual expenditure to do this for our students in our district. And as of today, it's actually about 1,700 students that are receiving this. So 1,700 students coming from within our SBCC district, so the community college district, which encompasses 2 large public districts, and then every manner of private, homeschool, every completion you can think of, that's what we're including. So it's really broad-based. We did about 100 interviews in the community to figure out what would be supported, and came back with unanimous support for this. So in the end, what we're trying to do here is show, gather the data that will show that this is actually going to move the needle on student success, student persistence, student completion. And you can see here in what I've handed you a little bit of that data. The first couple are just a little bit about the loads that students carry. We required the 3 things that the research all agreed on. Full-time student status. We know there's, of course, a complication to that because there are some students where that's just not possible. Also, taking advantage of our community, well, the various types of counseling on campus. So it can be cohort style, it can be with our general counseling department, and then we have to have students actually matriculate within a year. So we have about a year's window from their high school completion. When that was all said and done, you can see here our completion and persistence rates to date. Now we're only in our 3rd year, so we only have 1 cohort that's made it all the way through. But what we can show is that we've been able to really boost the persistence rates in those first few semesters. So this is going back just to the fall of 2016. We actually have about an 85% persistence rate for that 1st to 2nd semester, which is the benchmark that we're now working with for everything else. The 2nd and 3rd cohorts, there's some more data here about what they're studying, but I think the most impressive are these last 2 graphs, if you look at full-time status for the last 10 years. And what you'll see, the bar graph gives the details, but that full-time status line graph, it basically inverts. So by requiring and supporting full-time student status, what we have is going from a 2-to-1 to a 1-to-2 ratio as far as what are our local students doing. So that's really probably the most powerful data point we have to date, which is that by incentivizing and removing some of these barriers, that's actually working. And now we're just in our 3rd year, so we know that we'll see some variation there, but that's really the first. And then to move on to the dollar side of it, which of course is what we're here to talk about today, if you look at that last block graph, we tried to show you by stacking the various forms of support what we're doing. Now, in our case, we started this exclusively with private fundraising dollars, so just philanthropy. And then with the rebrand of the BOG waiver and then the introduction of the California College Promise, there's more pieces to the puzzle. But if you look at that stack, what it shows there is that the California Promise grant actually covers about a little over 1/3 of the total cost of what we're offering. And so we think that is, of course, the foundation. That's the longest standing offer, and that is the baseline of support. You then see there that we cover the enrollment fees for the remainder. And then the largest piece of this, and again, this is another demonstration of data I'm sure you've seen, is that it's actually the books, supplies, and everything else that is the greater barrier. And that's what we're covering exclusively with private philanthropic dollars. Of course, if we could, we would go beyond that and offer other full cost kind of support. But at this point, that's what we're offering. And that's what we're seeing. The things we're grappling with now, and I think the things that are going to be grappled with, obviously, in the budget process are 2 primarily. One is the messaging around this. So for those of us that are raising dollars philanthropically and calling it a college promise, and of course that's the history going back to 2005 in Kalamazoo, Michigan, when additional things branded as college promise enter the playing field, we have to figure out our messaging. So our messaging has to get clearer. And that's the biggest challenge we're having right now with our private base of support. So we don't want to give the impression that it's over. We don't have to do this promise anymore. In fact, what we're saying is the state is continuing to step up and offer new sources of support, and this core privately funded promise is still what we're asking our community to do. So that is within our community. The other piece is, of course, the branding around the college. Is it free college? Is it full support? Is it total cost? All those different terminologies get very confusing to the general public when they're trying to support this. And so what we're trying to do is find ways to introduce this as this is what our community offers through philanthropic means. This is what the state is offering. We often lead with the fact that, the California leadership has done the best in the entire nation about keeping fees low when it comes to enrollment fees. And still, for many students, that is a barrier, and the bigger barrier is actually everything else. And so it's the everything else that we're talking about when we talk about College Promise in our region. We are looking into a few other things, which I think in the coming years we'll get a better handle on. We're looking at additional supports, the AB 19 funds, and you've seen in your report that the incredible variety of how districts are using those is both a blessing and a big challenge, because you can't message that across the state in a single way. And there is no single explanation for where those dollars are going. So what we're trying to say is, here's what we're doing locally, here's what we're doing with the additional support, and of course, if we see AB 2 money coming through, then we'll have that same conversation again. So that's essentially where we're at.
Okay, thank you. I have some questions, but looks like over here first, Supplemental Limon.
Great, thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for presenting, particularly from those from the district. Jeff, thanks for coming. I'm looking at your the block graph here, and so I'm just curious for all schools, is this similar? Because according to this, the California Promise grant is about a little under 40%, if I read it right, a little under 40% of the total cost of attendance. I remember when I was in college, we really talked about the total cost of attendance. When I worked with college students, we didn't just talk about the cost of tuition. Is that similar for all districts, where it's slightly under 40%, that's really what California's free college does? It pays for that, or does that percent vary based on region? Yeah, if you can all speak to that.
Anyone can speak to that, right?
Yeah, it certainly varies on, obviously the housing cost is the great variable. This this graph here does not show that. So this is only the hard cost of attendance. So this is not showing food, housing, anything else. This is just the cost of attendance, books, supplies, fees. In our case, the greater variable here is certain CTE programs, say culinary or marine diving tech, are going to have much higher supply and other requirement costs than, say, an English associates, which is going to be a smaller cost. So that's actually the greater variance that's averaged into this block. It does not account for other costs.
And Ms. Limon, I would simply add that our factor, the number that we use, is $18,000 for full cost of attendance at a community college in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So of the 18,000, if that's the full cost of attendance, what does the California Promise actually pay for? What percentage of that 18,000? Because it sounds like it doesn't pay for all 18,000.
No, it's 8 to 9%.
It pays for 8 to 9% of the.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Because there's $1,380 is the fee waiver.
Oh wow, that's low.
18%.
Yeah.
All right, and then it was just.
Similar. I think those percentages are very illustrative of what you would see up and down the state, and that the tuition fee waiver, it's a hurdle, but it's only one of the hurdles. And I think this is a very important movement, looking at the governor's proposal, Assembly Bill 2. There's also Senate Bill 291 that's being explored on the other side about the expansive needs and supports their needs, especially for our low-income students. And so it's not one policy that's going to solve all this, but I think Promise is a very important step because it removes the barrier of tuition and it simplifies the message to families and incoming students.
And as pointed out I think beautifully from the Santa Barbara example, they're able to leverage the College Promise for tremendous civic and philanthropic support so that they can rally around the notion that every person in their community should go to college. So that's what many of our communities have done. It's a leverage point. It certainly is.
Great. Yeah. And now the second part is there have been, some descriptions of kind of how we can enhance, whether it's the messaging or the work, and you're in front of all of us now. Could you provide suggestions? I mean, it's just been identified that there could be ways to leverage more if we messaged it in a different way, if we partnered in a different way. What would those suggestions look like?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that parsing out the types of barriers and the types of costs is useful, and I understand the simplicity of a free college messaging, but it's actually a disservice in the long run because it gives people, it creates assumptions about what is and what is not covered. And historically, when we look at the way colleges talked about, we're talking typically about the tuition and the fee, or maybe room and board if you're talking about a residential four-year. And so this way of talking about college, especially community college, is really relatively new, especially in our communities. And we have generations of students at our colleges who remember it differently, talk about it, think about it differently. So it's really a retraining of total cost means, and then we have to talk about the housing, the food security, and of course tuition, books. And if you actually tier that, the most useful thing I've seen on that, and I'm sure my colleagues have seen this, is TICAS research, the Institute for College Access and Success. And what they did is they compiled all-in costs, so the total cost of attendance, and then backed out a pro rata share of what financial aid, grant aid, not debt, is available. And what they did is they essentially inverted that hierarchy. So the assumption that a four-year UC is actually the most expensive, it actually inverts in most regions where the community college is the most expensive because so little grant aid is available. So in that context, this becomes a really valuable tool, and the leveraging and everything you can do around it. So that's the messaging we tend to go for.
Yeah. And Mr. Moen, I would add that still, to this day, there are still many communities, families, who still believe that a higher education, even a community college education, is still out of reach. For example, this fall, 57% of all of our new attendees were first generation in Los Angeles in 2018. So you think about that, almost 6 out of 10. So there's still new entrants, so we still need to communicate the benefits of a higher education, to go local, to go low cost, and really to extend the larger message, which we all know, that an educated citizenry is the way to go. It has fueled California's economic strength for decades. Starting, if you will, in 1960 with the proliferation of colleges and universities, when California invested in its infrastructure of higher education and in its human capital. So it's the same sort of messaging now, that we need all persons in California to be responsive, eligible for, and accommodated, and in higher education and community colleges are the place to do that. We still are trying to find ways to fulfill the baccalaureate degree gap that is needed to keep California competitive, if you will. The investment that is made in higher education is by far the best investment California can make with respect to investing in its people. It alleviates other kinds of, if you will, social service supports and other things. If we don't educate folks, the costs are too high. So the messaging needs to be around the need for, benefits of, and why it matters in multiple languages, since we have a multilingual state. Beautifully a multilingual state.
And I'll just briefly add two messaging considerations. I think one thing that's very important is we've been able to go to our donors, as was pointed out, and say the state has skin in this game, but we need more to finish the puzzle, right, in terms of this total cost of attendance. And so I think that the more the state can continue to do, it allows us to go back to those same donors and say, the state's now added a second year for tuition. We need your help to add a second year for books. So I think that's one thing that I hope you're considering. Secondly, I think one messaging thing, and I don't have a solution on this, but you'll notice we consistently refer to the Board of Governors fee waiver, even though it's been the California Promise Grant for a number of years. And that's created a little confusion in the marketplace out there, because we have California Promise, which is first-time, full-time tuition free, and we know that students who start full-time and complete those units are more likely to succeed and complete on time. But then there's this other Promise grant that's out there. So that has created some confusion with our student populations, their families, even with our counseling staff. And so that's something as a state at some point we might want to consider, how to differentiate those programs more clearly.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's like an apple's not an apple. Like, why would you? I'm not sure why we named the same thing twice, but that's for another legislative proposal. But I did want to mention, I know Mr. Gallagher has some comments here. Just real quick, we just had a event outside with the CSU students, and they were talking about how 82% of their, well, you said it's 18% for for 18% of the cost for tuition, so it's 82.
Oh, no, 18,000 per year.
But you said it's 18%, roughly.
Oh, no, 8 to 9%. It's
8
much
to
lower.
9%.
Yeah, it's much lower.
8 to 9%.
Wow. The full cost of attendance.
Yeah.
When you include the cost of living, books, and other costs of attendance. The tuition part is...
Over 90% of the cost of community college is non-tuition.
That's correct.
Yeah. So at CSU, the students were saying it's about 80%. So it's still that's the point here. I'm going to come back to you guys in a bit, but Mr. Gallagher.
Yeah, I was going to get into, have you seen any kind of data or have you tracked any data? And I know we've only had this for 1 year now, but showing that we've had, more students than we otherwise would have, and also on that same line of that same track, that you have students who've come in right now under the Promise program first year who are saying they would not go for a second year because the fees would then be reinstated.
Yeah. We have some data. So ours goes back to 3 years now. So the data we do have shows our initial projection based on our enrollment. So for example, in our local high school district, 800 was the median enrollment over the prior 5 years, 805. So we projected our Promise participation based on that data point. What we discovered is that when you offer and incentivize and build a structure like this, we didn't think there was much room to go up because our capture rate in district is already basically 50%. As it turns out, there was room. So instead of having 1,300 students in the Promise at a time, which is what we'd projected, we're at 1,700. When we look at overall enrollment, same thing. And actually, if you look at the graphs in that presentation, you'll actually see we had two simultaneous trends. So we've had falling enrollment for 10 years in our district, but local enrollment has actually leveled out and now begun to increase. So our overall enrollment is still dropping. And there's a number of factors, we believe, for that, including the proliferation of Promise efforts, keeping folks more local. But we're actually seeing an increase, a considerable increase, close to 15% in our local district.
And Mr. Gallagher, if I could add on, the Los Angeles story is also a good story. While our overall enrollments are a little soft, and they are soft statewide, we saw an overall increase of 24% from our LAUSD student graduates over 2 years to LACCD, and that's significant. To put that in numbers, we had 4,063 students participate year one. This was before AB 19 was enacted, and with AB 19, we had 5,400 in this second year, and we're moving towards 10,000 by 2022. So that is something that we're moving towards. So the answer is yes. Yeah. Would these students have otherwise come? Well, the Los Angeles Unified School District college-going rate is 60%. Putting it in different terms, 40% of LAUSD students do not go to college. That is unacceptable. So this program allows us an intervention to increase the college-going rate of students who could benefit by it the most. Would these students have normally come year one, year two? Well, the persistence rates that I shared were significant. Over 90% from fall to spring, and then 76% from spring to fall. Those momentum points, as students gain academic confidence, gain courses, and take English and math in their first year, English and math has proven to be either a gatekeeper or a gateway into completion. So these students taking those courses their first year, the higher persistence rates suggest that this program is working, and it's working for the most academically and lower income students that our communities have.
Is that 40%, are we including in that? What about folks that might go to a technical training program?
60%, any form post-secondary education.
Yeah, so you're including all, not just not community college, but any kind of like CTE or other type of program.
That's correct. Yes, 60% of LAUSD graduates go somewhere post-secondary. 40% do not enroll in any post-secondary environment. That's very high.
Right.
Of the 32 or so thousand LAUSD high school seniors. So this program is allowing us to ameliorate that issue. That's why LAUSD has been such a very, very committed and strong partner in this effort. We're changing the lives of families by allowing them to go to college tuition-free.
Yeah. So even though it's kind of a misnomer because it's not the tuition, it's your point, it's 90% of college is not the community college tuition, but it's a hook, to get the students and the families to. But do you feel that's a little bit deceitful because they're showing up like, hey, where's the rest of my financial aid to pay for everything?
No, sir.
And I think just to add on to that, because I think is also if you can stay local, which you've seen your local enrollment, maybe you can stay with family, or you can stay, maybe it is a more affordable housing situation rather than having to go to another place, right? And where housing might be more expensive. Is that?
If I can just add something to both your comments, it definitely is a hook. To your comment about what are students saying about the next year, that's definitely something we're hearing anecdotally from students of, okay, I got this first year, what's available to me? Now, some of those students will qualify for governor's fee waiver. We have other scholarship and support programs on campus, but it's enough to get me in the door. It's a hook, but it's not enough to really give me a good chance at completion. And so that's why I think the second year is so key. And as we try and drive down time to completion, matching our funding for Promise in alignment with our target for that, I think there's good alignment there with your other initiatives that you supported as a legislative body along with this one. So I think that's very important. And I think the more the state could do for tuition and fees, the more we could do with our local communities and our philanthropic partners to support books, other costs of attendance, transportation, things of the such.
Well, and Mr. McCarty, your question is a good one and an important one. And as you'll notice, as part of the criteria for College Promise participation, students must apply for both state and federal financial aid, which allows them to receive all the maximum supports that they need. So technically, they could receive $9,000 to $10,000 in aid as it stands right now if they're a fully eligible student. Now, unfortunately, our undocumented students are not eligible for federal aid, so we look to our partners in the community, our foundations, to provide other supports that undocumented students can't receive, and which we have many of.
Yeah, so as far as the aid, the good news is Assemblymember Medina, myself, Quirk Silva, Gabriel, and Bernard Horvath were at an event at 9 o'clock, and we unveiled a major financial aid proposal from the Assembly we're pushing forward. We've been working the last couple of years to dramatically expand financial aid to cover non-tuition costs for community colleges, CSU, UC, and other colleges as well. So that's certainly in our agenda to push this year. As the other question that Mr. Gallagher was talking about is success. It's not just more enrollment, which is a good thing. We need more, of course, helps you financially, your districts, but we need more people with college education, degrees and certificates. But you're showing success of the students going full time.
Yes,
right?
correct.
Yeah, and so that's frankly a bigger victory.
Oh, it's a huge victory because incentivizing, because we know as students remain full-time, they're committed to task, they do better, they are able to stay on campus a lot more to receive the other kinds of supports around them. They build learning cohorts. Full-time matters. It's probably the single most important success factor for our students. And that goes across income and goes across age, full-time enrollment.
Okay. So the reason we invited you here today is because, like every other government program, I think it's important for us to have oversight, not to just pass new laws and move on, but to talk about how we're doing in the first year. And we've heard stories. I've heard from my locals here at Los Rios that this is successful. And so we, of course, are looking to expand it to year two. We were looking at potentially all full-time, not just first-time full-time. We're still trying to figure out, penciling that out. I know we had some conflicting numbers back and forth. So I guess the question we want to ask you here today is, absent from the Chancellor's office, and you're all independent at your districts anyway, are there any tweaks that we should look at with this program besides obviously you support year two? Anything that we ought to be looking at and doing differently? Any more flexibility, less flexibility? This is your chance to share with us about this program.
So I would say the flexibility I mentioned earlier is both a blessing and a curse for us. I think the matching of what we're doing and how we're doing it is the key challenge. So we're a district, for example, that is still having the conversation about how those AB 19 dollars get expended. We wouldn't be there had it not been for the fact that we had a pre-existing 2-year privately funded Promise effort. And so I think the flexibility is good, although the ideal for us would be that the legislature would approve the funds to actually buy out those fees across the board and simplify that, so that as we mentioned earlier, the creativity that the private philanthropic dollars can add to that. would be the goal. So I would say if we could do anything, it would be to make that a simple formula, and then to use the philanthropic dollars to be the add-ons. At this point, those are not replaceable, and that that was clarified early on in AB 19 from the Chancellor's office, that if you already have a program, these dollars from AB 19 cannot be used to buy that out and then and you move on. Ultimately, if this is solidified as an ongoing funding source, I would argue that we should be able to do that, because then we can get those other dollars applied to things like housing insecurity, food insecurity, other kinds of bridge
Maybe
programs.
we can get some clarification from the Chancellor's office as far as what the issue he's raising is. Is that currently permissible? Help us understand what the issue is here.
Yeah.
Thank you. We've given districts broad flexibility, so I don't want to contradict anything my colleagues have shared with folks, but I would say in general our approach has been districts have discretion to use AB 19 funds and further discretion compared to existing law to use it for fee waivers.
Well, I would only add from a policy perspective, because there is impaction at the California State Universities and frankly at the University of California, where many eligible students are being turned away because there are not enough eligible seats available to them, have some kind of formal way that they can come back to us as first-year full-time students with guaranteed admissions and enrollment, and then guarantee back their admission 2 years later. Something that would make that process a lot more seamless, so that we have a higher education system working together to support the needs and interests of a higher educated community that is California. So something along those lines. To echo our Vice Chancellor here, we have used the flexibility quite well to meet the needs of students. So that, for us, is going very well and suits our particular needs. But I'd like to put this, what I believe is a model legislation, model program, in the context of all California three-tiered higher education so that they can work together.
Yeah. And how does it work for, is it first time? Let's say you go to UC Santa Barbara for a semester or a year. You're like, you know what, I need to go to Santa Barbara City. And so is that person first time? Is it first time community college or first time college student?
It's first time community college, I understand.
Yeah, so they would
qualify.
First time college going.
They would qualify.
Yeah.
First time college or first time community college?
Like enrollment, special admit.
I would say the way we've been allocating the funds is on the basis of first-time community college students system-wide. Right. So a district would get funds based on the number of first-time community college students at the college. I will say in the implementation of the statute, we expect that districts are awarding the funds fee waivers to students who are non-California College Promise Grant eligible, only to first-time, full-time community college students. That said, I think that's I think we need to do work thinking about how we would make sure that students aren't who do not meet that requirement are not otherwise getting fee waivers.
I think the issue is that of the 2 million community college students and a couple hundred thousand UC and 500,000 CSU, it's not all linear, perfect. Everyone has the same track, right? All of us had different path to get where we're at today. And so as we put these programs forth, we need to figure out, how we don't have students trapped and how we have flexibility in this. And I think that's what we're looking at. And I don't know the answer right here today, but as we look and expand this Promise program is what can we do to address the issues you're talking about today?
If I could add one suggestion from a policy standpoint to improve this is, I think right now we have 115 different messages going out about Promise, and I think one thing that we could learn from what Oregon's done and Tennessee's done is more a universal message that's coming. I know there's a proposal for some support for this, a universal message that's coming from the state level about this access to tuition. We'll still want to have our local messaging, but something that gets the word out to students, parents, families, taxpayers, people throughout the state that this is available to our students now, and whatever the consistent element of it is, if it's fee waiver that's consistent across the state, that consistent element, and that individual benefits may vary by campus. I think we could be more efficient with our dollars and more efficient with our messaging if we had a more centralized effort.
And included with that, excuse me, why it matters.
Yes.
Why it matters. California has the ability to eradicate the tremendous wealth and opportunity gap that exists in our communities through a program such as this, through our California community colleges. But that's a really important message, not just to get in, but why it matters to be educated, to be eligible for and participate in the gig economy, the innovation economy, those other tremendous assets that California has. Without these kinds of opportunities, we're building and perpetuating a wealth disparity that we can no longer sustain. So, I'd like to include in your consideration of the messaging why it matters for California and why it matters in the equity equation.
Okay.
Yes. Mr. McCarty, I know you know this, so I hesitate to jump in, but I would just say, I think as we think about expanding this, today we collect about $435 million in fees. So, the governor's proposed essentially an increase, decreasing that amount by about $40 million. I think larger expansions, we've costed out an estimate of about $100 million more to waive tuition for non-first-time students who are full-time. I think the rules of the game for the past 30 years has been we fund community colleges at the level required by Prop 98. We would argue that shouldn't be the rules of the game, but to the extent those remain the rules, then I think I think there are hard questions about where those dollars don't get backfilled in the community college's budget. So what do we do to support the costs that I think are very real for full-time faculty, for other costs that we also know improve student success at our colleges?
And I would separate this sort of experimental phase from the others. So my comment earlier about the blessing and curse of that flexibility is that right now that's been a blessing to be able to figure it out. The curse side is the communication side. And once we're clear on this and there is long-term funding at whatever level we end up at, I would say simplicity is key. We've found, form follows function. Structure and incentive structure is critical. So whatever we land on, we need to make that as simple as possible rather than a new program or a new application, simply to use the strongest parts of the system as they are, bolster those, and let those, experiments around the margins or with philanthropic dollars continue to push forward. But that to me is where we need to go, is that simple, clear, this is what we do, this is why we do it, and give it, and let the flexibility then come in with other sort of experiments on the margins.
And then, do you have the flexibility to use some of your campus money to focus on for the non-first-time students?
We do. We do through other fund sources. Correct.
Yeah.
Because it's our responsibility to support all students who are there. So that is correct. Yeah, and there's flexibility in the student equity and access funds.
Yeah.
To do that.
What about the chancellor's office? With the state money, do these districts have the I know that's not enough to go around, obviously, but would they have it in a case-by-case situation, or how would that work?
We have the statute requires colleges to collect the enrollment fee. I think there's been long-standing interpretation that suggests that using state general funds to pay enrollment fees who are not otherwise, for whom enrollment fees are not otherwise waived would be is not allowed under those laws. So I think clarification about whether colleges can use general funds to pay enrollment fees would be helpful.
And the only thing I would add to that, sort of as the philanthropy guy here at the table, who's working primarily on that private support side, philanthropy in the community college system is very new relative to the four-year system, and it shows up in the numbers across the board. So the data point I most often repeat as of late is that if you look at what Americans give to charity, we crossed $400 billion, according to Giving USA a year and a half ago. Of that, the second largest piece goes to education, and that's just 14%. But only 0.2% actually comes to community colleges, and yet we are half of this nation's college, serving half this nation's college students. So I think if we want to invest in this, philanthropy should never take the place of our public commitment, but we certainly can build and leverage the philanthropic partnerships around this. So if we get clear and message what we are doing as from the public side, that is incredibly valuable to the broader community that wants to support higher education. And community colleges really should move to the center of that, and that's what we try to do.
Mr. McCarty, if I could weigh in on his incredible point there. It also deals with the financial aid discussion that you're leading. That is, here is the pool of Pell funds available to all Americans. 50% or so of all higher education students are at the community colleges, yet of the Pell funds, 10% is distributed to the nation's community colleges, including California, which is the largest segment. So we're not getting our fair share of the Pell funds of those who would otherwise be eligible. So these are policy discussions that all leveraged together, braided together, could really make towards addressing those gaps in the total cost of tuition and the total cost of attendance community college.
Yeah, so I love to seeing these communities across California doing it on their own too. Here in West Sac, they passed a sales tax measure, and they're putting some to their Promise program. Wow. In San Francisco and LA, you're doing it in Santa Barbara. And so, of course, you can use that money to make your programs more robust and cover the books and tuition, and I'm sorry, non-tuition, so books, transportation, and so forth. What do we think as far as the 100 or so community college districts across California? How many of them are using other money to strengthen their Promise program?
I think so. We have not done a systematic analysis. There was research done last year that said there were 42 communities that had Promise programs that leveraged both state funds but other private funds.
So maybe half. Okay. All right. Thank you. This is certainly an issue with broad support up here, and we're certainly going to support the governor's proposal, which was part of our recommendation through our bill as well, and looking to strengthen as well. So keep us informed how we can make this program work even better for Californians. Thank you for coming up.
Thank you.
Hold this issue open. With that, we're going to move on to our capital outlay agenda item, and we are going to take a vote on this issue. So trying to get some of our members back here so we can take an action item on this. Okay, please begin.
Randy Katz, Department of Finance. Thank you, Chair McCarty, for the opportunity to present the 2019-20 capital outlay proposals for the California Community Colleges. The 2019-20 administration's proposal provides $361 million in GO bond authority for 15 continuing and 15 new community college projects statewide. Should the 2019-20 administration's proposal be approved, $734 million of the $2 billion in Prop 51 funds provided for the community colleges would be obligated. Consistent with the administration's criteria for capital outlay project funding statewide, the projects recommended for funding address critical infrastructure fire life safety issues. While fire life safety issues aren't necessarily the sole reason for a community college project to be considered for funding, it should be a significant driver. When determining which project should be funded, the administration considers whether a requesting district can provide some level of funding match or if there are extenuating circumstances that prevent the district from contributing. An example of the latter would include Redwoods Community College, a small district with significant infrastructure needs resulting from recent seismic analyses. Other examples would be a recent unsuccessful attempt at passing a local bond or demonstrating that a district has reached its bond capacity. Concerns have been raised that the administration's approach creates a disincentive for districts to maintain their facilities. However, the community college notes a need for $16.6 billion in state funds over the next 5 years, well in excess of the remaining $1.3 billion in Prop 51 bond funds. Therefore, we find it unlikely that colleges would purposely allow their buildings to fall into disrepair, risking the safety of its students, faculty, and staff. Thank you for this opportunity.
Okay. Thank you, Eleo.
Edgar Cabral with the Legislative Analyst Office. We had two recommendations related to this issue. The first thing we recommended is that the legislature consider approving more Prop 51 bond funding for community colleges than what was in the governor's budget. We noted that this administration does, the Newsom administration does include many more projects in their budget than were included in previous budgets under the Brown administration. But the state is still on a pretty slow pace for exhausting all of the Prop 51 bond funds. I think at this point it's about a 9-year pace to exhaust all those funds. So that was the first set of recommendations. The second set of recommendations is really to address this issue of how life safety projects and how life safety is used in evaluating whether projects should be included in the budget. The Chancellor's Office has a long-standing process for that has a sort of separate way to review life safety projects, and then all of the other projects are evaluated based on other needs, such as whether there's a need for modernization or for additional instructional capacity. The administration has been also looking at through a different life safety lens, looking at all projects that way, which has created a lot of confusion for districts in terms of trying to just understanding why their projects aren't being approved and which projects are good candidates for being submitted. And we think also by looking at everything through a life safety lens actually means that the administration's approach would be prioritizing projects in districts that potentially would have done a poorer job of maintaining their buildings. So for those reasons, we would recommend that the legislature require the Chancellor's Office and the Department of Finance to come together to develop one agreed upon criteria for how to review life safety projects.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Krishna Osmendi with the Chancellor's Office. I'm starting on page 12 of the handout that I distributed earlier. Just wanted to provide some background on infrastructure generally to provide some context for this conversation. You all require us to produce a 5-year capital plan that identifies needs and priorities. Our current plan, 5-year plan, projects needs of $30 billion. Of that, about $11 billion is for new facilities, about $20 billion for modernization of existing facilities. Clearly, that far exceeds the amount of state funds that have been authorized in recent years. Community college districts primarily rely on local funds, including local bonds, to meet their capital needs. The state also provides capital outlay funds. Districts can generate other sources like gifts or donations. Proposition 51, enacted in 2016, authorized $2 billion in funds. And so what we have asked for follows a process of prioritization that takes place within the system. So I just wanted to describe a bit of how the Chancellor's Office puts together the requests that it submits to both the Department of Finance and to you. If you look at the bottom of page 12, you'll see on the right-hand side a chart that shows 6 categories of projects. Essentially what we say is, using a very strict definition of fire and life safety, any fire and life safety projects, what we call Category A, get included in our request. Then the remaining dollars that we think are available for that year get distributed across a number of 5 different categories, mostly focused on growth in instructional space. But we also include modernization of instructional space, a category that includes facilities that would help to build out a comprehensive campus, and then both for modernization categories of instructional support and instructional support growth. And so turning to page 13, as both the legislative analysts and the Department of Finance have noted, our spending plan that we had proposed to the governor and the legislature for 2019-20 included projects totaling $551 million. Of those, 19 are continuing projects for a total cost of $503 million, largely for the construction and equipment phases of those projects. But it also included 39 new projects, total cost of $48 million, largely for planning and working drawings. We appreciate the staff recommendation that would fund that request, and I am happy to answer the questions.
Okay, thank you. So this is an item that obviously the voters spoke a few years ago loudly when they passed the bond for K through 14 education facilities. And unfortunately, the last few budgets haven't recognized that commitment. So what we want to do today is to approve the proposals in the governor's initial budget, as well as add the other projects in the agenda item written up by our staff on page 24. I think that would be in tune with what our colleges need across California, and again, adhere to the will of the voters. So with that, looking for a motion? Okay. So we have a motion to approve as budgeted the capital outlay projects in the governor's 18-19 budget, as well as the additional projects listed on page 22 and 24. So with that, we have motion and second. Please call the roll.
McCarty?
Aye.
Limon? Aye. Medina? Aye. O'Donnell? Aye. Motion passes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All righty, we're going to move on to issue number 4, the online college. Go ahead.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Heather Hiles. I am the relatively newly installed CEO to the California Online Community College. I was looking forward to just giving you a brief update and then answering any questions that you may have about where we are in our process. And with me is Julian Roberts, who is the CFO for the California Community College Foundation.
Good morning.
I've been on the job a little under 3 months now, and so far what we've prioritized is selecting a name for the college, and also working kind of backwards from some of the deliverables that we have taken on with the college, namely the most important being establishing our first set of training programs that will launch on October 1st. And they include one in medical coding, a second in IT fundamentals, and a third in cybersecurity. And so we are doing all of the things that we need to do to set up our college and district to be able to deliver those training programs starting October 1. We will actually start enrolling students in August. There are so many things that are systems that we're just in the process of setting up that I could spend the rest of the day telling you about those. But probably most importantly, we're starting to recruit an executive team to focus on. We have in place our CTO, but we still need positions filled such as a COO, a CFO, a Chief Success Officer, a Chief Learning Officer, et cetera.
Okay.
So, yeah, there you go.
All righty.
Go ahead. I'm here. I'm just here to answer questions.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So, can you outline a bit more on the 2 programs and the implementation and the rollout?
Yeah, there are actually 3 different training programs that we're going to launch, and they are, as I mentioned, medical coding. One is a second is the fundamentals of IT, and a third is cybersecurity. What's interesting is that medical coding actually was identified by the members of SEIU as a great paying job and a wonderful opportunity for its members to get additional skills and to get placed into those jobs. And I think it's a very interesting opportunity for working with working adults and imparting and impressing upon them the fact that this training program gets them into the sector of healthcare and very well prepared for working in that sector in the future. But those are actually jobs that are being made obsolete through different kinds of technology. And so I think it's a really good opportunity to illustrate to people that it's not the final destination in a job, but it is the starting point for many different types of jobs that could be in that sector. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. And so we think that it's interesting to really impress upon people that we are working in an economy that is changing ever more rapidly, and that people will need to acquire new skills to stay relevant. and to thrive. And so this is a really good illustration, I think, of that particular point. Unlike cybersecurity, which is the second track that we selected, where there is an explosion of new types of jobs and new responsibilities ever increasing in the cybersecurity area, but yet you can be an administrator, learn the first kind of level of cybersecurity protocol and increase your salary by, say, $20,000 a year. So, so those are two different types of training models, or two different kinds of, I think, experiences that our folks will get through those programs. You'll recall that we are building skills upgrading programs that address the needs of the over 8 million Californians who are underemployed today.
That our Chancellor's Office, Christian, came up to? Some of these are kind of twofer type questions. Of course, you have your job, and I respect that. And I know we have many quasi-independent colleges throughout California. And has there been any feedback or pushback at all from the duplication potential and competition, Christian?
I think we've heard, we heard much of the feedback last year as this college, is being considered by the legislature. I think there has been some conversation that districts offer similar programs. I would say the difference between what we see the online college offering is that its programs will be competency-based in a way that the programs in similar fields are not currently at the other community colleges.
Mm-hmm. And then as far as the structure, the fee structure, has that been settled yet, or will it be the same as the community college fee structure?
I would defer to President House.
Thank you. So we are actually working on a model whereby we expect employers to pay their fair share to prepare the workforce of tomorrow and their workforce from the California population. And so we are planning to actually invest in our learners and have employers invest in those learners rather than passing along the fees to the students themselves. We think that they are going to invest tons in the form of sweat equity and don't need to actually pay more money that they don't have for these training programs.
I would say, the statute does specify a clear standard generally that the fees charged by the online college are consistent with those charged at the other colleges. I think our office has a role to make sure that's the case. I don't think we're there yet.
So paid by the employer, what if there is no employer? What if an individual trying to get there?
That is one of the differences in our training programs compared to a traditional community college. We are actually training people for jobs that exist as defined by the employers, and we work with them in their curricula to make sure that our trainees have acquired the competencies for their jobs. We also are building in paid work experience or apprenticeship into our training programs. So these are really driven by existing jobs with employers at the front end and throughout our training programs.
So your programs will only be programs that have been sanctioned and essentially partnered with,
where they're
paid
actually,
for by an employer.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. And then as far as
and then, I'm sorry, just to add to that, then also our budget will be going, our internal funds will be going towards providing more of what some might call wraparound services, but we believe are critical to our learners being successful on the job. So that is having coaching and a lot of life skills training on both the front end of the training as well as once they're placed into the jobs.
Yeah. And then historically, online higher education has been a mixed bag. Frankly, for students who have more experience, more education background, it's been more successful for them. And students who haven't had a lot of experience and education wherewithal in the higher education system, it's not always easy navigating, as we talked in our prior panel of first generation students and so forth. So, of course, there's student services, which are extremely, valuable and really needed to help students cross the finish line. So, online, being on your phone or what have you, how is that going to work out? How are we going to ensure that the students aren't slipping through the cracks?
Well, again, we are recruiting folks who are already working, but they are underemployed.
Yeah.
So they're looking for additional skills so that they can have better jobs and hopefully one job with benefits rather than 3 jobs without benefits. So we are working with a highly motivated population who will need both a combination of in-person instruction as well as opportunity with flexible time to be able to acquire new hard skills through online. I ran a portfolio with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation where I studied specifically how developmental education reform, digital learning, advising, and financial security supports emergency aid, financial aid, would help first generation and underrepresented minorities complete college.
I think
so I'm a bit of a...
The question, it's more about support services. So there are highly motivated individuals who have jobs who go to LA City College, and they still sometimes need the counseling and the support service, not the education piece. And so, that's there. And so clearly there's the EOP office and specialized programs and Puente and Mojo, what have you, when you're at a campus.
Yes.
How would those students be able to do this on this virtual platform?
2 things.
Where would
One
they
is
go if they need help?
2 answers to the question. One is that I want to acknowledge that our program is not going to be fully online, that there will be in-person contacts between the learner and a mentor, as well as a coach who's helping them navigate the workplace, learning how to communicate with their supervisors, all the things that one needs to do to be able to be successful on the job. And these coaches will be with people throughout our training programs, from the very beginning of an appraisal period through the actual training, both online as well as while they're at the work site, as well as once they're placed into the job, we'll have success officers working with them to continue to help them grow and develop in their jobs. And it's interesting because some of the CEOs of some of the other community colleges, specifically I'm thinking of the, Kevin who runs Compton Community College, said, we also need online tutoring supports. And so if you can make sure that we're able to leverage some of the technological supports you get in tutoring, that would really help our students as well. So we know that we need both real-time access to information and content for free through devices, as well as a lot of folks in our program do not have the networks to even get interviews to the right jobs. And we're here to help